Welcome back to Contracts and Coffee. I am Stephen Long, broker and real estate instructor, here to go over the next section of our offer to purchase and contract standard form 2T. And we are now on page 8, and I'm ready to dig right in. So get your coffee. I had to upgrade my mug, and let's move forward. All right, so on page 8, we jump into a continuation of the seller's obligations, and we're in subparagraph D at the top of page 8 that essentially says that the seller must remove all their material belongings as well as any garbage or debris from the property prior to possession. So again, there's actually a conversation you're going to have. Anything left in that house at the time the buyer takes possession becomes property of the buyer. So Mr. Seller, if you want it, make sure you get it out prior to closing. On subparagraph E, it's an affidavit and indemnification agreement. It just says that the buyer or the seller basically does not have any outstanding mechanic liens and will be signing a waiver stating such. A couple of other things in this section. With letter G under that same page, it basically says that the seller will be providing a general warranty deed. It is in big capital letters there, general warranty deed. If in the event you are selling a foreclosure or some other property or something that maybe even comes with a trustee's deed or a special warranty deed, you do have the ability to scratch out that general warranty deed portion and write in the type of deed that will be delivered. Again, any changes like that have to be initialed and dated by all parties, but we want to correct that to make sure that the seller is not obligating themselves to deliver a general warranty deed if in fact they cannot. In that same paragraph, though, it also goes on to say that the property must have legal access to a public right-of-way. So this is that whole we can't sell landlocked property. So if you're selling a property, it needs to have some sort of legal access to a public right-of-way. If you're getting a loan, obviously not going to be a problem. But if you are buying cash, that's just something you need to be aware of, is you need to have that access to a public right-of-way. Under that same section, there's a couple boxes. Two of the boxes there I want to take a minute to talk about. The first one is that it is a reminder that Mr. Buyer should in fact get their survey completed and returned during their due diligence period. Survey can sometimes take a little while, so if you're planning on doing that as a part of your due diligence with your buyer or your buyer's agent, make sure that you are giving yourself enough time to get the survey complete and returned, because if you have the survey returned after 5 o'clock on your due diligence date and you find an encroachment, then you are already past your due diligence date. So that may become an issue where you could lose your earnest money, and the seller is not obligated to repair it necessarily. So want to make sure we get survey complete before due diligence. In addition to, we also have title insurance and title search. These are things that the attorney will do, but typically not much more than a week or so before closing at best. So if you want to have that title insurance and title search done, which I highly encourage a buyer to do, get it done during the due diligence period, so that if something does show up, if there's a judgment against the seller or some other hidden deed restrictions or easements that we may not have known about that might be in the public record that we just somehow overlooked or was not made available to us, an attorney will find that. So I highly recommend getting that title search done during the due diligence period as well. The next box just says if you're going to be doing a short sale, consider doing the short sale addendum. We are going to look at several addenda in following videos, each respectively, so we'll get to those when the time comes. But if you are doing a short sale, lots of cans of worms there, but also consider doing the appropriate addendum. Under section H, we're talking about the deed and who the deed is to be made to. Typically, we just see this line as who the deed will be made to. But there's a couple other things I want to point out in that same section H. It says that the seller will pay, just like in pre-license class, you remember, the seller will pay for preparation of the new deed, they will pay the excise taxes, and they will pay their prorated taxes. So that's where they're so subscribing to that. Those are customary and charges that the seller will pay, and so that's why we want to make sure we highlight that. But also, following that is the new deed will be made to. This is important because whoever is on this line is who will own the property going forward. The deed, if it's an LLC, is it being deeded to an LLC? Is it deeded to a husband and wife? Is it being deeded to an estate? Is it deeded to a living trust? So make sure we get very specific with that, because this does go to the attorney, and they're going to reference that as to who the deed needs to be made to. So under section I, agreement to pay buyer expenses. Now you will also have to explain this to both buyer and seller. So in a typical offer to purchase, this is one of the line items that we're going to look at immediately, and this is how much of the buyer's closing costs are we asking the seller to pay. So if, let's for example say the buyer's buying a $100,000 house, they may ask for as much as, say, let's $3,000 of seller paid closing costs. What that means then is that the seller, right off the bat, is getting $97,000 because they are going to contribute $3,000 of that 100 back to the buyer for the buyer's closing costs. Now, I see consumers get confused on this because they're like, sure, I'll pay closing costs. They assume they're paying their own closing costs. So Mr. Seller will have their own closing costs, including deed prep, taxes, the commission, things like that. And then the buyer has a lot of closing costs with origination fees, loan fees, funding fees, appraisals, termites, home inspections. There's a lot of expenses on the buyer side. So that's why this line item exists, is so that the buyer can ask the seller to assist them with some of those closing costs. Now, I would highly encourage you to talk to the buyer's lender to determine how much we need to consider putting in this blank, so that you're not, quote, leaving any money on the table. You don't want to ask for $10,000 in buyer paid closing costs when you could have got the house for $5,000 less. So we want to make sure that that's an appropriate number. It could be zero. You don't have to add any closing costs there, especially in a hot market where sellers are getting multiple offers. They may be more inclined to take an offer that does not have any closing costs requested of them. So that's a line item to keep in mind. The other thing here too is and actually it goes on to say it in the box right underneath that, it says if you were going to be getting an FHA or VA loan, make sure you also consult with the lender. But there are some things that the buyer cannot pay for. For example, the buyer in a VA loan cannot pay for the termite inspection. So you would ideally have some monies built in here for the seller to contribute, because if the buyer can't pay for it, that really just leaves the seller. So having that addendum, having that conversation with the lender to make sure we have enough room in our requested closing costs to meet our need. And also goes on to talk about under Section J, the Owners Association fees and dues, that the seller is going to pay any of those as required by the HOA or in the transaction of the closing. So they would pay any fees or anything that needs to be done to make that close. Now, if there's a buyer's lender requiring financial statements, for example, from the HOA, that may very well be a buyer cost to procure those documents. So be a little bit diligent in, is it a fee that the buyer's lender is requiring, or is it a fee that the seller's HOA requires to sell the property? And so depending on who is incurring that charge as to who pays it. Also goes on to say that there will be a payment of confirmed special assessments. Again, we've talked about the proposed and confirmed assessments, and the seller will pay those. And also on the kind of last section of page 8, one of the things I wanted to hit on here was the negotiated repairs and improvement, paragraph M, that says that the seller will complete all repairs in a good workmanlike manner prior to closing. A lot of people in the due diligence repair request will have this negotiated out and expect it to be done by 5 o'clock on the due diligence date. It does not have to be completed prior to due diligence, to be agreed upon prior to the end of due diligence. The seller has up until the time of possession to get it done in a good workmanlike manner, and the buyer has the right to inspect it as such. This is always one of the grayest areas in the practice of the negotiations, because the seller is going to find the least expensive to get it in a good workmanlike manner, and the buyer is going to be expected to be done in the most expensive good workmanlike manner. And as we all know, just like clean, there's a little shades of clean, just like there is shades of well done. So I'm a big fan of additional funds or closing costs in lieu of repairs anytime we can do that, just because this is a difficult item to negotiate. But if you do need to negotiate it, also make sure you re-inspect it, because once you close, if it was not done to your expectation, closing constitutes acceptance. You're accepting it in the condition that it was in. Your only repercussion, if it's not done the way you want it to be done, is to delay closing until it is corrected. So that is one thing that you'll want to keep in the back of your mind as you are navigating repairs and negotiations going forward. And that pretty much takes us through page 8. So some important topics there. I hope you got something out of that. In the meantime, I hope you are also going to be enjoying your coffee, and we'll see you on page 9.